So once again, Chairman, distinguished members, the Chairman of Board of Directors of the Chartered Institute of Directors, the President and members of the Council, including past Council members, the Executive Secretary, Financial Reporting Council, the Chairman and MD of MOFI, thank you very much for hosting this program. Our colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, it's an opportunity to be here and also to apologize for not being there physically due to some few challenges. My presentation is brief. I'm only leading discussions with eminent members of the panel, throwing a lot of light. Basically, I normally start by looking at a table. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure the presentation has been shared, but Professor Nat-Ofo used to say that corporate governance is about getting the right people to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. I'm also proud and happy to note, and of course, most of our colleagues in this hall will testify to the fact that Financial Reporting Council, the various institutes, professional bodies, and other professions, including NCGS, have done very well in terms of the journey so far in respect of the private sector code of corporate governance. To date, substantially, most members, both medium, long-term, mid, large, and small companies, have actually signed on to this code since 2018 when it was launched. And to date, I think we are proud to say that as far as the private sector is concerned, we are doing very well. And of course, I believe the Financial Reporting Council with the ES and titles around, they should be able to testify to that fact. And including, of course, even the Chartered Institute of Directors, having also regularly participate in board appraisals, basically. So for us, I think we've achieved a lot: greater accountability, broader delegation of authority, higher ethical standards are being built, and essentially creating awareness in our respective responsibilities and getting as many professionals as possible to support in evaluating and providing feedback in terms of corporate governance. So to that extent, the private sector code has worked very well, but of course we still have some few challenges that have to do with ownership and control, whistleblowing, and some other things. But what has happened so far to date, in terms of the benefit that has accrued to us, transparency and accountability, efficient management resources, risk management processes have actually improved. Basically, trust is being built because strong corporate governance ensures that trust is also guaranteed. Economic development, given the fact that if you have well-run institutions, we expect that they will perform very well. And then the culture of regulatory compliance, which is voluntary. And to that extent, that is the most important thing, basically. Now, sometimes in 2023, the Minister of Trade and Investment inaugurated a committee, of course, being coordinated by the Financial Reporting Council under the chairmanship of Barrister Daladi Kifasi, the former head of service, and with quite a few of us also participating as members of that group. And Anson Young has been supporting us with active participation of the Financial Reporting Council. To date, we've gone far. We've prepared the draft code for the public sector, and we're in the process of consulting with various stakeholders, and we hope and pray that very soon we'll have a code. Now, this code has essentially slightly different from the private sector code, given the fact that it is slightly fashioned after both coercive and non-coercive, sanctions or measures that will ensure that, but largely to identify who is a public official, what is the framework for performance measurement, remuneration governance, basically audit and risk management, transparency, code of ethics, basically relationship with stakeholders, and other related things. But somehow it is structured in largely three components. The first component is the principle is stated, just like the one we have in the private sector code. and then what is going to be the intended outcome. In other words, if you apply this principle, this is what you expect. And how do you apply the principle? So what are those recommended practices that you need to go through? So basically 3 components that have been identified, and it is that respect. Of course, as you are aware, we need corporate governance for a number of reasons. To improve efficiency of our public sector institutions, definitely assure stakeholders that yes, their primary concern is the concern of the public institutions, engage in innovation and creativity, and also promote transparency and accountability, and as well as also assures that those who are given that trust and responsibility will manage those institutions in the best interest of the stakeholders. And to do that, of course, we need to standardize our practices. We need to improve transparency and also accountability, basically. And for us as a country, we believe there are countries that we can target at. Singapore is a very good example in terms of public sector governance. So also New Zealand, they have consistently been at the top of public governance institutions, basically, largely. But what are those things that perhaps we need to look at? We've done very well with the private sector, voluntary compliance, and people are getting things done. But in public sector, it's slightly different. First, given the fact that you are looking at the public, so in other words, a much wider group. But beyond that, of course, given the fact that you have institutions that are slightly structured, different from private institutions, and therefore we still have challenges in terms of what you can consider to be corruption, for instance, basically political interference. In other words, how do you ensure that a particular action is taken in the best interest of the community, basically? And also capacity. Do we have strong capacity within the public sector institutions that will drive such businesses? And of course, the fact of the matter is that for the fear of unknown, you have resistance to change. You want to move things to be done differently, and somebody will tell you, no, you can't do it. You need to do it differently, or perhaps you have. And then weak or perhaps even lack of risk management framework and practices. In public sector, we don't have that substantially, except, of course, some of our parastatals that supervise private sector institutions. They seem to benchmark their practices along that line. But beyond that, public sector officials are not being properly compensated. And so to that extent, the incentive for them to do the right thing without compromising their ethics become quite a major issue. And of course, stakeholder rights. A common man does not have the right, or perhaps has the right, but does not have the capacity to enforce that right, or may not even know the right to enforce basically, and that creates a huge problem. But then how do you get a regulatory oversight? In other words, who's going to supervise public sector entities to ensure that they do the right thing? For private sector, they are either regulated by a particular entity, or perhaps they belong to a particular association, and therefore, based on that, or the shareholder themselves may take necessary steps to supervise the governance. With public, it's virtually impossible. And therefore, what do we need to do as a country, basically? Yes, we'll come out with a court, but for us, this court should be a court that is not a court that will try to enforce, but it's a court that will try to encourage Nigerians and say, this is the right way to do things. And if you do it rightly, you'll be compensated or be rewarded for doing the correct thing. Now, this is an extremely difficult issue. But then, supported with that, of course, is the openness. To what extent can we ensure that whatever we do as public institutions is opened and people have access? Not just access by way of, by way of freedom of information, but access that is voluntarily provided, whether on their website or perhaps regular publications, so that if I want any information about the Central Bank of Nigeria, I should be able to get it, just like the same information, for instance, I get on the stock exchange about private sector institutions. Now, so for me, is the challenge is to ensure that as public sector institutions and having strong policies that will open up public institutions to scrutiny. We're trying, some public institutions are trying, but generally it's a big issue. And of course, people try to get a bit sensitive and also try to politicize it. If you request for an information, they say, why are you coming from and who are you? And why do you want this information? Largely. Information of procurement. We started procurement policies during obvious days. It was then a small due process and just trying to review, what do you call it, contracts. Subsequently, we now have an agency and even a career path for procurement officers. But are we better off than when OBI was doing it? Definitely not. What has happened is that people have developed a template that all they need to do is to tick the boxes. And to that extent, yes, it says we need to advertise. You put up an advert in a obscure paper, or perhaps you don't even put up the advert. You just get the necessary document and somebody stamped those documents and said, yes, you have met the requirement. So clearly, it's our ability to influence that culture and that attitude and that behavior to ensure that, yes, as public officials, we're doing this not because there is a law or there is a sanction, but we're doing it because we need to do it and it's part of our DNA. So inculcating and influencing DNA, honestly, is one major issue that we need to do. And therefore, to do that, of course, we need to invest in training and capacity building of our public institutions. We need to promote, build a culture of transparency and accountability. We need to engage stakeholders at all levels. Of course, usually as public officials, we believe that stakeholders, we know what they want, and therefore we tell them what we need. And particularly at the subnational, is even worse. A governor sits down to say, I need a road, I will build a road to your village. And meanwhile, what you need is water, or perhaps something different. He does that regularly. And this is something that particularly those of us who have recently been working with subnationals can testify to the fact that engaging stakeholders and getting their buy-in and for them to even understand what you're doing is a major issue. Of course, a big town hall meeting can be held, but this is just for the sake of it. So what can we do to ensure that whatever we do, that yes, we can get them done? Of course, we need a very strong reward and sanction regime. If you do something wrong, you should be sanctioned, no matter who you think you are. And to that extent, necessary behavior will be developed. Then, what is our role as Institute of Directors, as professional associations, and other corporate other SROs? I think our responsibility is to continue to inculcate that culture in our members, and also to come up with a framework. How do we also get involved in promoting that governance in the public sector? Today, in the private sector, we don't have problem because we can be engaged to do a review, which is the third-party review that gives an assurance to stakeholders that this is how this institution is being run. Can we do the same thing in the public sector? And basically, can we also have as many independent directors on public sector institutions, parastatals and others, so that at least we know that, yes, we have that, not that people that are just being posted or appointed because they know somebody that is there. So I think it is important that as a takeaway for us as an institute is we need to look at that. Of course, some of us are still members of that group, but also to look at and see how do we create a role for it. There's nothing wrong in creating a role because we represent the public. And as a private sector people, we have that culture, we have that experience, and we have that determination to achieve the right thing. On that note, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I believe whatever we can do to build strong corporate governance in the public sector, we should be able to do that. And I believe all leaders at various levels and stakeholders, we need to prioritize and invest in corporate governance. Let's work together to build a very strong public sector institution that is efficient, transparent, and accountable. On that note, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to lead this discussion. Thank you and God bless.
After we've listened to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
For the governance practices in the public sector. And I do think that's quite seminal. I had, in my introduction, drawn attention to the fact that the topic for this session is enhancing public asset values and benefits through governance practices. So, and I had encouraged the panel to make sure that we strike a balance between what's in the topic for this session constitutes the end, which is public asset valuation and public asset benefit, and what constitutes the means, which is governance practices. So, and you have helped us to lay the background for the conversation of governance practices, in contrasting private and public. We could move towards convergence. We are in a situation in which public regulatory agencies actually encourage private organizations to comply with world-class governance practices. But if the same standard could be applied to public sector, to be the better for it. And the other part of the conversation, which I hope that discussers will pay attention to, and if you get a chance to respond to what the discussers have to say, or what question might come up for you, if people have questions, if they, ushers could, help us pass pieces of paper around and, collect such for us so that we can save time, look at the questions after listening to the wisdom of the discussants, we can look at it. So that second part, you are no stranger to it, is the issue of for enhancing public asset values, governance practices for enhancing public asset benefits. You've been the chairman of the technical committee of the Bureau for Public Enterprises. You've been a member of the National Council on Privatization. Much of the work on the National Asset Register were initiated during your chairmanship of the technical committee, and I'm glad that the then Minister for Finance had run with it, and today we have Ministry of Finance Incorporated, which is in custody of a very large number of national assets. As at the date of MOFI incorporation, we were talking about assets worth 18 trillion naira, which President Buhari charged them to manage and grow the value to 100 trillion naira. Okay, so one of the co-hosts of this, have assets, values to enhance, have asset benefits to actualize, and it will be great if this panel can contribute to that. On that note, I'd like to call upon the discussants to take the floor and speak to the subject. I want to start with the executive director portfolio at Mofi to take a few minutes and
looking at that side. I'm here.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, please.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
You're
welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, our chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, my MD, fellow directors. Good afternoon. I would like to start this conversation with the question that has been echoed by my Abu MD. If today you want to know the outstanding loans of Nigeria, both foreign and local, you just enter where? Just enter BPE. No, not BPE. DMO. DMO will give you the exact outstanding asset last week or asset June ending. But if you ask, what do Nigeria have in terms of assets? Nobody can give you the correct figure. Nobody. So that is why Mofi has been created. The board of Mofi has been reconstructed with this mandate. We have to know where the assets are, in what condition the assets are, and what are the values of those assets. It's only when you answer these three questions that you will be able to drive value from these assets. I'm sure if today you go to a bank and requesting for a facility, they will not ask you for, if you present even last year's valuation of your asset, they will not accept it because of the serious inflation that has been going on, exchange rate. So last year's valuation will not hold water. But here we are, our assets have not been valued for 20 years, for 15 years. So the mandate is for us to get clear values of what we have, where are they, in what conditions, so that we have leverage on those assets. By the time you have all these figures, you can take your assets anywhere and collect facility, foreign facilities, local facilities, and you go and do your other businesses or develop other sectors. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the key mandate of Mofi. The second mandate is to professionalize the management and operation of state-owned enterprises to meet high standard of performance and transparency. How do you achieve that? You can achieve that by giving clear instruction and clear mandate to the people that are meant to be managing the assets. You can also have clear risk management process to mitigate loss of assets and even misuse of the assets. And sadly, it's very important also to look at the regular performance monitoring and reporting to the stakeholders. And finally, you should have strong audit process that is independent. That will enable the auditors to have clear and precise records of the assets that we are talking about. The most important aspect of this discussion, we are talking of corporate governance. What does it entail when we to this discussion? We should have a good governance, a good board that is equipped with experienced board members. And the board should be independent. These are all the issues that we look at to have clear benefits or to have clear values on our assets. And the last one, ladies and gentlemen, is strategic resource mobilization. Anytime these assets required your assistance, you can, of course, raise value, raise credit for them. You can raise funding for them to do other transactions. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will rest my case here with these three major mandates for Murphy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I thought it was important that we heard from the horse's mouth, as they say, because Murphy, you represent an organization that is charged, by the country to spear ahead, the asset valuation and the process in the country and the governance of that process, and at some point, the conversation has to be expanded to, managing the, governance of the asset valuation process. I know that in one of Murphy's mandates is to create a deal room where the asset owners can queue in on the sell side and investors can queue in on the buy side, and regulators, can also be up. So how that is governed, that's the deal room or the hatchery. But please let me call on Mr. Johnson Chukwu to be this next discussant, while Mrs. Okundare is warming up, and we will end up with Mr. Gunilo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Teriba. Please permit me to stand on the existing protocol. When Dr. Teriba made his opening comments before Dr. Ahmad presented his paper, he said that the panelists should bear in mind that should focus on both the end and the means to the end, and should emphasize the means to the end. No, should de-emphasize the means to the end, and then make sure you have a balance between means to the end and the end. But Dr. Ahmad pointedly said that corporate governance is all about selecting the right people to do the right thing at the right time and in the right manner. So there are 4 R's. So that, in effect, has actually said that corporate governance is about the means and not the end. We all know that corporate governance failures are where the focus is on the end and not the means to the end. So when we talk of enhancing public asset value and benefit through corporate governance, so we're basically saying, how do you set up the structure that mimic what you have in the private sector, in the public sector? There is no single public sector asset that it does not report to any agency, ministry, or department. It just means that probably the MD that is responsible for that asset is not fully aware they have the asset or the asset reports to them. And in that case, you have to start from the critical components of corporate governance. One is issue of reporting. Reporting ensures that you have tracking of what you are doing, you measure what you are doing, you compare the outcome of what you are doing to the intended outcome, and that you have a process that ensures that what you are doing can be replicated and can be supervised. So that takes you to, apart from reporting, who are those you are reporting to, which is about constituting the necessary and properly qualified persons to supervise the report you present, which basically what we do in the private sector. You have a board of directors. You are supposed to render reports to the board of directors every quarter. The board is supposed to meet a minimum of 4 quarters. There are board committees that drill down on those reports you present. Then the third component of it, which is getting the right people. So how do we have in the public sector the quality of people that provide the necessary oversight function? And I think Dr. Ahmad also made reference to what we need to do. He talked about enhanced capacity building, and he also talked about the possibility of having independent, non-public sector people being involved in the governance structure of institutional managing public assets. Because basically, you're talking of institutional managing public assets. Do we have those institutional managing those assets reporting regularly on the assets they are managing? Do we have, who are those that get the reports? Are they accountable, both in terms of, because in corporate governance today, you are beyond the fiduciary responsibility, you also have personal liability when you are involved in managing assets or overseeing the operation of a business. So we need to bring those structures into governance in the public sector. It's granted that the public sector incentives are not the same with the private sector, but we can adjust, align those incentives to ensure that values are gotten for those assets, that those assets are properly managed, and that those who are managing those assets are responsible for the integrity of the estate they are managing, the earnings of those assets, and that public sector resources invested in public assets will get value for money. So some of my recommendations are this. One, we need to tweak the boards of ministries and departments of government that are responsible for asset management. Like I said, every government asset reports to somebody. Some we may not remember, people may not know it reports to them because there's no, in terms of the performance standards are not well aligned or well defined. So we have to define the performance standards of all the MDA heads. So we need to agree on the performance appraisal periods. We need to agree on the oversight bodies that will oversee what they're doing. We need to agree on the incentives and the sanctions associated with carrying out those oversight functions. And they must be similar to what with the private sector. And we must make sure that the arms of government also work the way we are supposed to work. Some of these agencies are supposed to present their budgets to the National Assembly. That process must take place. The agencies that present their budget to the National Assembly must also present their performance cards to the National Assembly at regular intervals at that level. So if we begin to implement these things, I believe we'll begin to get better value for the assets. We will ensure that the assets values are enhanced, and we'll ensure that we get value for money, because at the end of the day, all of us are the losers for failure to manage public assets. Thank you.
The question is, why are we looking at corporate governance at all? Why is it an important topic? You know, there are two things which Dr. Teriba mentioned earlier. There are the economic benefits that we get from it. If we manage our assets properly, there will be economic prosperity. There's also social benefits that we get from it. Social benefits in the sense of better lifestyle for our people, but more importantly, we're also proud of our nation. When the keynote speaker spoke earlier this morning, she talked about young people leaving Nigeria. If we had a better accountability or better management of our assets, our public assets, then we would not have people leaving Nigeria because of dissatisfaction in the provision of infrastructure, for example. You know, so many things have been said. I know I have 5 minutes to speak, but I will just summarize that if you look at what are those practices? Management and accountability. And I'm glad that the FRC is already putting together a code of corporate governance for the public sector. I think it's important that whatever we do, we try to institutionalize it so that it's not dependent on one government. Once that code of corporate governance is in place, yes, it's not going to be mandatory. You have a choice, but when you actually adopt it, you are rewarded for it. Countries that have done this all over the world, have been very successful at doing it. If I look at a country like Singapore, which the speaker spoke about earlier, a case in point in Singapore is where they've there's corporatization of its air hub. And today it's one of the most important airports in the world. And I think that if we take the example of Nigeria, in spite of our diversity, if we consider the corporate governance for public sector, and in addition to that, we overlay that with accountability, and we overlay that with strategic planning, then we're sure that, we can begin to derive value from those assets. I listened earlier when the MD of Mofi mentioned that the assets that we have is about 41 trillion. And one of the directors is also saying that we haven't valued all of the assets in a long time. So imagine, number one, if we valued all of these assets, just pure valuation, we know that will be more than 41 trillion. If we now overlay that with corporatization of the different companies, the 40 assets that we have, we set it up as different companies on their own with autonomy. And we layer that with corporate governance that is being set up by the FRC. It's the beginning. We're not going to get there in a day, as the keynote speaker spoke about earlier, but it's a step in the right direction. If I look at what we've done with open government participation, we're a member. There's a few things that we have done, and I know that Mr. Ahmad had, mentioned a few things. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area, but it is a start. We now have portals where people can go and get information. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. And we can only improve on that. And the key agencies or the key parties that can make this happen are here in this room. And when there's a will, there's a willingness to work together, then we begin to build that foundation that will ensure sustainability of these assets so that our children who have gone away can come back and Nigeria can be a more prosperous nation through the effective management of these assets. So I will leave you with 3 points. The first is strategic planning of the assets. And this goes back to what Mofi will be doing a lot of, overlaid by corporate governance. There's accountability. We've talked a lot about reporting, the essence of reporting, not only our own local reporting, but meeting global standards. Companies that have done well all over the world, part of government, if you look at the South Korean train system, it's the same thing. It's owned by government, but it's managed independently. And it reports on on the management of its resources. So if we look at that, and the same thing with Changi Airport. So with the assets that we have today, if we're able to manage those assets and report on the management of those assets, financial reporting, operational reporting, it will help to enhance the value of those assets. And lastly is sustainability. We need to manage for the future. We need to manage for the future. The keynote speaker spoke earlier about the importance of green, climate consciousness. Those are things that we need to bring. They're not nice to have anymore. There are things that, at the public sector level, we need to begin to pay attention to and see how we can bring this into management of public assets. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Oguniro.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. When the MEC said we had just 10 minutes, the lawyer in me was asking me to move for extension of time. Okay, I'm going to intervene in just 2 or 3 areas. Number one, I want to stress that corporate governance is about means. It's also about the end, because we speak about process, purpose, and performance in corporate governance. In fact, there's a whole lot of work on the means and ends of corporate governance that we can look at. When I was preparing for this, I also play in real estate and infrastructure space. So I took a look at some reports, and they're all available online. And there's a particular report by the Chartered Institute of Project Management of Nigeria, which speaks about abandoned projects in Nigeria. And I encourage all of us to take a look at that project, at that report. That report says that there are 56,000 abandoned public projects in Nigeria, not 5,600, 56,000 abandoned projects. And on the top of your head, you can think of the main corporates, Ajaokuta, Mambila, Tinapa, and so on and so forth. Now, so I thought that the rationale behind this topic is just to look at what are those levers of corporate governance that we can pull to drive our public assets in a manner that will get better benefit for it, you know. And I think we have to start looking at public assets differently. We have to create a long-term vision for public assets. That will enable us to invest in assets that are beneficial and that we can start and finish, that will not stop midway. That is very critical. That will also enable us to invest in assets that we have all the components. I mean, we've had instances where we've tried to invest, we've tried to create a public power plant somewhere in Delta. We've imported all the equipment, only to discover that there are no roads to take those equipment to the sites. You know, we've had those instances in the past. And I think we have to start looking at the life cycle. You know, as a real estate and infrastructure person, you know, I think part of what we need to do as a nation, we have to start looking at the life cycle of our assets. We have to, from the beginning, be intentional. From the time you plan, you have to start to think of decommissioning. So think of acquisition, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning of those assets. Now, when we begin to think in that integrated manner, we will see that there has to be a reason why we are investing in this public asset. You know, OECD always talk of critical infrastructure. They are called critical because they are created to provide for the well-being of the people. And when they are not there, you know what are the consequences. We know what has happened to refineries in this country. When we are in a nation for 25 years, refineries have not refined anything, and we keep on pumping money into them. You can see the negative impact on the whole economy, you know. So, and one of the speakers also mentioned an area that corporate governance is very particular about, which I want to mention. It's about accountability. One of the fundamental pillars of corporate governance is accountability. When people are put in positions of responsibility, when they take decisions, they must be accountable for those decisions. I think part of the problem that we've had as a nation is that people have not been held accountable for investing wrongly, for starting projects wrongly, for not finishing projects. You know, what we do, we just recycle people all over the place. We have to start taking proper stock of what people have done in previous positions to know whether or not they are suitable for other positions. Corporate governance stresses accountability. You cannot have authority, take responsibility, and not be accountable for your decisions. Unfortunately, time is gone, you know, and I just have to stop on this note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In closing, well, we've listened to all our discussants, and I don't know if Mr. Ahmad is still on the line. We can afford to give him the last say on the subject, but I want to get back to two of the discussants who say that corporate governance is about means, not end. To say that our topic, the topic of our session, is not corporate governance. It's about enhancing asset values and benefits through governance practices. So to that extent, corporate governance in the context of this conversation, it didn't even say corporate governance. It said through governance, right? It didn't say corporate governance, because not all assets are companies. Okay, that's the difference between MOFI and BPE. The Bureau for Public Enterprises governs, looks after companies. MOFI looks after companies and non-corporate assets as well. So maybe the lesson is, to what extent can MOFI and all of us concerned about, national asset valuation, close the gap, learn from, for example, the Nigerian Stock Exchange or the bond market, the FMDQ. These are valuation governance processes. Are we together? That is not necessarily a company. That involves collection of different companies in FMDQ is public-private sector. Are we together? Everybody take their state. Assets get valued and benefits, we extract enhanced benefits from us. If Mr. Ahmad is there, he can have the final say. Is he?
No, sorry, Ayo, you can close.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
To thank all the discussants and panelists. I know that we can't close the session. I notice indeed that the second panel is also still, on how to develop the country, through, and I see that the chief executive of the NGX is also the background speaker there. So it's apt that we may begin now that we are talking about MOPI, capturing asset values to the tune of 41 trillion. The market capital, you can begin to benchmark that with the market capitalization on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, and not just, the debt from the BPE. I thank all discussants, for your rich contributions. I thank the background speaker for setting the ball rolling. And I thank all of you for your patience, for your kind attention.
This is really not a question. I think it's a remark. One of the things that we need to do in our country is that we encourage the behaviors we want to see, which is service to the nation needs to be encouraged a lot more. And I want to use this opportunity to really acknowledge Dr. Ayo Teriba for what MOFI is today. For many years, he's been shouting at the bottom and at the top of the mountain about the importance of knowing what we own, not just what we owe. He's been very consistent with that message. And the establishment and the transformation of MOFI was partly as a result of that call that he made. So when he speaks about assets and corporate governance, for those of you who may not know him, he's a professor, but in this particular case, he's not talking about it from just concept or textbook. It's from a practical. And the manifestation of what he's been talking about is what MOFI is today. And on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank you for the work you've done.
Thank you so much, sir. We have just one final surrender. I mean, sir. Okay, that will be the final, and then. All right, the last.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the panelists for very rich discussion. But my point really goes to the very sound observation made by Mr. Guniron. He has told us that we must have a system of evaluating those we appoint into positions. The problem of Nigeria is that we keep circulating the same people all over and all over and all over. And it's costing the country a lot. So we see a lot of wastages. We do not bother to assess what the person we are bringing has done in previous positions. So long as we continue to do that, we will see that people become complacent, they become unproductive, and even constitute themselves into dangers into the country. And so we must take away that point that there has to be a system by which, that's part of the things the National Assembly should do, but they fail to do that, by which we gauge previous performance and see whether the person is suitable for a new assignment. If we don't do that, all the things that we're talking about governance will fail. Thank you very much.
All right, one final thought over there, and then
Thank you very much. Mine is one of the speakers talked about creating a role for private sector participation as a means of assessing, as a means of enhancing public asset values and benefits through effective governance practice. Now, my question is, have we or can we establish pathways for us to create this private sector participation, like the independent directorship? What are the pathways for us to have this institutionalized in the public sector? Do we have strategies or pathways for this yet? Or is it developed yet? Or is it part of what we're going to do in this event? Thank you.
Right. I'd want to deflect this question to, if the MD permits, MD Murphy, if you want to shed light on, he's talking about the pathway. And what really comes to my mind is the deal room or the hatchery. If you want to speak to that, you know, because what is important in any evaluation system, you know, NGS, FMDQ, is inclusiveness. You know, that everybody, you know, who has a role to play, one room, okay, one stop. So please, if you want, can you tell us, you know, what is planned, what is intended, what's the pathway for that, what should we expect? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tariba. The original master plan when Murphy was established or restructured was that there will be a number of things to be done. The first one is to identify some of those high priority assets across different sectors of the economy, and then create transparent platforms through which partners, investors can participate in expressing their interest as to whether or not this is an opportunity that they have an interest in. So in terms of what is being done right now is, as you know, we've established the assets register. And in that assets register, we're engaging different MDAs who are currently supervising those assets. It's a lengthy process. And as you can imagine, in some cases, there's quite a bit of resistance because many of them believe that that is their territory. So there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done to make them comfortable that this is not about taking it away from you, but it's about optimizing this asset so that even you, that MDA, can benefit from it once it becomes successful. So there's been a lot of stakeholder engagement across different ministries, airports, seaports, solid minerals, landed properties, because these are assets that we see that investors have an appetite for. And so we've established that assets register, and we're engaging each of those MDAs to bring them to the point where we're working together to, first of all, do valuation of those assets, enumerate them, because some of them are quite extensive. So think about TCN, which would the assets that will soon become TSP. Think about all the transmission network you have in this country. So it's an extensive exercise. That obviously is under, work with Ministry of Power to do that. You think about federal government landed properties. Many of them are here in Lagos. Almost everywhere you turn in Lagos, you find those. Of course, in partnership with Lagos state government to do that, and then across the country as well. And then you talk about our seaport infrastructure, airport infrastructure. So these are quite extensive. The idea is to now begin to, we're working with IFC as one of those entities to begin to create a framework that would allow us to bring those assets to a structure where we determine that we have enough information about them, do valuation of it so you know your starting point, and then you create the rules of engagement that any party that is interested in investing, they will come to the deal room. And in that deal room is where people would make offers and there will be counter offers. It is at that deal room that we would know who is the best partner to work with or a consortium of partners to work with. And then what type of transformation, whether it is a concession, privatization, or partial privatization. But none of this will happen without you creating a corporate entity that would hold those assets. It is that corporate entity that allows you to know a verifiable proof of ownership. And then it is also that corporate entity that you now use for the pathway towards even public offers, which the DG SEC will speak about later. Because until we get to the point where we are able to establish proof of ownership of our assets, until we get to a point where we're corporatizing those assets, we will not be able to put the right governance. Most of these discussions around governance is around corporates. And then value creation would also be the point of exit. Before you enter, as you know, before you enter any investment, you need to know how you're going to exit. And there are different forms of exit, whether it's a partial sale or it's a sale to a strategic partner, you need to have that entity to be able to hold that. And then, of course, we're hoping that at some point, we'll get to the point where our capital market is bigger than our assets, the assets that we have. Because the way we're going, we may end up at the position where just the federal government-owned assets that have been corporatized and valued might actually be bigger than the capital market. I don't think we want to be there. Because the time when you begin to really extract value from those assets is when you put them on the pathway for listing. Thank you very much.
Well, I thought that you would be best placed to offer the answer, and it hasn't proved us wrong. Thank you very much, MD.